And we are live. Welcome everybody to Lubbock Compact Live for Wednesday, April 27th. And we are a little bit late starting up the show today, but that'll be okay. We have a special guest with us today, Dr. Millerick. And of course, I am your host, Adam Hernandez, and this is my co-host, Dr. Nick Bergfeld. And so, Dr. Millerick, thank you for being on with us today. And for everybody listening, what we're going to be discussing, or what Dr. Millerick will be discussing, is radon. And I'm sure that a lot of folks out there may not know what that is, or if you've heard about it, you may not know why we should be thinking about it. And so Dr. Millerick is trying to do some testing for radon. And so I will let her, after she introduces herself, we'll talk all about radon, what it is, why we should be testing for it, and all that good stuff. And as usual, if you have questions, we do have the Facebook open, and we will see your questions and comments, and we can pass those to Dr. Millerick as they come in, or if you have just a comment or question for the show. So so Dr. Millerick, I guess, could you just let the folks know a little bit about yourself, and we'll start there, I guess.
Yeah, sure. No, thank you very much for the invitation to come on. So my name is Kayleigh Millerick. I am an assistant professor in the civil engineering department, and this is not what I typically do. What I'm going to talk to you about today is completely different than what I usually talk about. I work with environmental microbiology. So in general, microorganisms that like to grow in aquifers, and to some extent, microorganisms that grow in a water treatment capacity. So I look at the types of microbes that grow that actually improve your water as opposed to serve as a pathogenic contaminant. I specifically look at how they change groundwater chemistry and how that affects the water that you drink. And so that is what the majority of my efforts at Texas Tech University focus on. However, most faculty members will do some sort of service, outreach, engagement, involvement, basically getting involved with the community that we serve. And in my case, my service project is completely different from the laboratory that I run. And as Adam said, I'm here to talk about radon, which is typically something people who have lived up north or lived somewhere other than Texas have heard about, where most of the questions that I get about radon are from transplants as opposed to native Texans. So if you don't know about radon, radon is a radioactive gas. It's a gas that forms as uranium and radium break down in the subsurface. A lot of just naturally occurring minerals will have trace amounts of uranium and radium. And as it breaks down, it becomes this gas that's mobile. And the catch there is the mobility, because it doesn't particularly matter if you have a couple of mineral formations 10 feet below your house that contain radium, you're never coming into contact with that. But as it transforms into the gas can creep upwards. Now, the gas emits anywhere where there's soil and dirt and an interface with air. But typically what happens to the gas is it just immediately disperses in the air. It gets diluted. It's non-detectable. The reaction in your home is a little bit different because the way that we build our houses, we tend to build houses that retain air. And so what happens as this natural decay process occurs and as this gas is formed, it has the potential to go through foundations, any type of foundation, and it will accumulate in homes over various periods of time, depending upon how quickly air goes in and out of your house. So what we have here is a natural occurring mineral that can be anywhere, that is not a threat outdoors due to dilution, but inside the buildings we live in and the places we work, it does have the tendency to accumulate. It's not detected through usual senses. It's colorless, odorless, and tasteless. However, it is carcinogenic. And it is the second leading cause of lung cancer in the United States. It's second only to cigarettes in terms of cause. And most of the time it acts synergistically with cigarettes. So if you do happen to be a home smoker, cigarette smoke plus radon can increase your likelihood of lung cancer by quite a bit. And so that's the reason we care about radon. Now, the reason why I mentioned that people who come from other places know about radon is because overall, the concentrations in Texas are pretty low. It tends to be associated with mountainous areas. We see a lot of it in Pennsylvania, a lot of it in Colorado. And while Texas certainly isn't flat throughout, we don't typically perceive Texas as being overly mountainous. And so people who move from Maine, Pennsylvania, I actually came from Illinois, which is a high radon state. Those are people that are typically aware of radon. And those states have laws that make you test for radon because of its prevalence. There are a couple of other factors that are likely to include radon concentrations in home. The big one's temperature. So if the outside air, ambient air, is much cooler than the air inside your home and you're running a heater, the likelihood of increases of radon in your house goes up quite a bit. The other external factor that tends to affect radon concentrations quite a bit is presence of a basement. And so homes that have a basement, you can see various numbers, but it's approximately a 4 times concentration increase if you're in that basement level of a home versus a first floor level of the home. And I give all that information because we don't necessarily see the temperature differentials in Texas that you would see in the northern snowy states. And while some Texan homes definitely have basements, a lot of them don't. And so you are seeing lower risk factors in Texas compared to some of those other states. That being said, there is one area of Texas that we do see high radon values, and it's the Texas Panhandle. And that's actually why I'm here today to talk to you about radon. And what I'm actually talking to you about is an Environmental Protection Agency sponsored grant. This is a congressional line item. So this is something that Congress funds every year, which is just increased radon awareness to everybody in high areas of radon frequency. And so Texas is a little unique because radon is typically managed by state health departments. And actually in Texas, it used to be managed by the state health department. It was transferred to Texas Tech in 2015. And the reason why it was transferred to Texas Tech is because, again, our radon is not throughout the state. Our radon is unique to the Panhandle. And so the grant was moved to the area that had the highest amount of radon. And specifically, it was moved to Texas Tech just because Texas Tech has a lot of connections with local communities. I'm not a native Texan, but one thing that I have noticed about Texans is that Texans like to listen to other Texans, and Texas in the Panhandle specifically like listening to Texans in the Panhandle and not necessarily the state health department down in Austin. And so that's the way that we've approached this grant, is going into communities and talking to homeowners and homeowner associations about radon, given that we all live in this area and we're all exposed to the same relative threat. Actually, out of all, and there are 46 of these EPA grants, 46 out of the 50 states will participate in this program. We're one of 2 that's actually run by a university. I think Nevada's the other one. But for all the other ones, it's run through a state health department. And in the case of the state of Texas, it's run through Texas Tech University, but is funded by EPA. So what does this program do? Well, if you look at the official EPA guidance as to what I'm supposed to do, the majority of it does not apply to Texas. And the reason for that is radon is regulated in most states. And so there's very specific guidance on you must run so many of these tests, particularly during a real estate transaction, or you must build homes and buildings a certain way, or and the different foundational checks that are mandated by the state. And that's not at all we have here because we don't have any legislation. What I'm running is just an awareness program and free information that if you'd like to test your home for radon, I'll cover all the costs. And so I do offer a variety of different types of radon tests. And we have our standard test and we have a slightly more specialized one if you're looking for more information. But what my program does is serve as a free informational source where you can ask for one of my tests. We ship it to you free of charge. We pay for the shipping to the analysis company, which is in Carrollton, that'll analyze that test for you. And if you need follow-up tests, we can provide information on that. And if you're one of the homes in the area that does see elevated radon, we can give you more information on what to do in that case. So in my case, I'm certainly not enforcing any rules because there aren't any in this area. What I am trying to do is I'm trying twofold. Number one, to get more information out to the general population. And from a more research perspective, I'm also trying to better understand radon behavior in the state of Texas. Now, that was a lot of information, and I can go on a little bit more, but I'll stop right there, and I'll kind of talk to you about my sampling program, but I'll take some questions just to break it up.
Yeah, so obviously, well, a lot of people may not know this, but I'm sure people who've lived here for a really long time know this. A lot of our houses are built with crawl spaces. Mm-hmm. And so is this something that would kind of, I guess, accelerate the radon in the home, or is it not the same as like with the basement? Mm.
So the answer is the most vague. Sometimes, perhaps, maybe, it depends. Let me tell you a little bit about crawl spaces. So what is going to happen if you do happen to live underneath minerals that are radon forming? That gas is going to come up and it's going to accumulate in your crawl space. And it's going to do one of two things, and it's going to depend on your crawl space. Most crawl spaces are vented. And so there's usually an escape mechanism for gas through those crawl spaces, provided there's air coming across. So if you have good ventilation and good air circulation, it's probably whisking it out. The other scenario is if you don't, it does have the potential to accumulate and then it'll creep up. So I didn't talk at all about testing or where you test, but EPA's recommendation is to test in the lowest livable level of a home, which when I talk to people on the phone, I define as wherever there's a couch and a TV and you're spending any amount of time. So this is chronic exposure. So this is going to be prolonged periods of exposure. So it needs to be somewhere that you're actually spending time. We don't recommend testing crawl spaces because chances are you're going in a crawl space maybe once a year to check for something and hoping that you don't encounter a snake. So this is not somewhere that you're spending lots of time. In contrast, if you are one of the homes in Lubbock that has a basement and you're using it as a den, as a kid's playroom, that probably is a good place to test. If it's just a basement where you've thrown the washing machine down and you go down begrudgingly once a week to do your laundry for 10 minutes, again, you're not spending any time down there. So that's probably not giving you an accurate perception of risk. But if it is somewhere that you're spending, a couple hours a day or a lot of leisure time, that's recommended for testing. So your crawl space scenario is it could have radon. But whether or not you're actually being exposed to that radon is going to depend upon how it's leaving the crawl space, whether it's going out into ambient air or whether it's creeping up into what I'm assuming is going to be a first floor home. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I always I try to think about it from the policy side of things. So the state of Texas is very unlikely because it's only localized here to do anything legislatively about radon. But if, for example, do you perceive the risk in, say, Lubbock to be so high that it wouldn't make sense for the city to, say, have a kind of testing program for houses that have either been built or for certain areas or, for houses that are newly being built or, what would this look like at a local level if now that there's this awareness about how radon exposure is an issue in the Panhandle, what could communities do, from a policy side of things to try to combat this?
I would love to be at the policy point, but I don't think we're there yet. And the reason I don't think we're there yet is because I don't think we know. So the Texas Department of Health and Human Services ran a survey in, I think it was 1994. It was about 20 years ago. Yeah, 20. Sorry, that's 30. Wow, I'm doing pretty crappy math here.
That happened to me earlier when I was thinking about the age of houses.
They ran a survey in 1994, and they took a survey, and I think it had 2,800 radon test points across the state of Texas. And their conclusions were the majority of Texas didn't have any radon, but there were some areas, and they specifically flagged the Panhandle as more information was needed. So I pulled that report just really quickly because I couldn't remember what the exact numbers are. That's based on 78 tests in Lubbock County. And so if you think about 78 household tests in Lubbock County in an area that has over 100,000 homes, is that a statistically significant representation? Probably not. And so what they saw was exceedances at the first floor level that was about 14%. So about 14% of homes that didn't have a basement that had a first floor were seeing radon levels that were considered to be in the dangerous zone. Now, during COVID shutdown, I looked at a series of radon values that had been collected over the last 20 years with several other faculty members here, particularly on the mathematics and GIS side, because that's not a strength of mine. And we looked at significantly more data points than that. I was trying to figure out how many we looked at, but I believe for the Lubbock area, it was closer to 600.
Wow.
We were seeing similar numbers. We were seeing an exceedance of just over 10% of the homes were coming back at that elevated level. But again, it begs the question, do we still have statistical representation? The area that has the highest amount of radon is actually the Amarillo area, and the numbers there are worse.
Wow.
You're drawing conclusions that, to me, from just looking at the radon values, look like extremely high radon values based on a really, really small sample size compared to the size of Potter and Randall County. And I'm not a policymaker, but my first question as a policymaker would be, can we really do anything about this given the data limitations? When you're dealing with less than 1%, do you have enough information to start putting in some of those policies that then become costly? And the answer is, I don't know. And I would turn that over to more of the political side, just because that's not my area of expertise. But just looking at the numbers, I would be extremely cautious about any kind of action until we're able to obtain more points, which is actually the second initiative of my project. Is from one side, I'm trying to educate homeowners as to what may or may not be in their homes. But on the second side, every single one of my tests that is given out, used, and mailed in for testing, it's another data point that I have access to help better understand what these numbers actually are in the Panhandle. One of the most frustrating things of what I do is the Radon website that I have two undergraduate workers that help me maintain. So if you send an email related to radon, they usually answer it. If it's an unusual question, it gets forwarded to me. I tend to answer all the phone calls about this. But the majority of our test kit requests right now are from the cities of Houston and Austin. This is ridiculously frustrating to me because there's no radon in Houston. There is little to no radon in Austin. It looks like there's a couple of pockets, but they're pretty sporadic with some pretty low numbers. If I were a resident of either one of those counties, this would be at the very, 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 very bottom of my to-do list. But yet the program that I'm running is spending money sending all these tests to Houston and Austin because I'm just trying to increase awareness, and I'm not getting those requests from the Panhandle, which is the area that actually does have the risk. And so that's the second reason why I run this is I'm trying to increase awareness in the areas that matter. And while I'm always going to send a test kit for someone who requests it, I think that you should know about hazards in your home. To me, it is alarming how few requests that I'm getting from this area, particularly the Amarillo area, compared to some of the larger metropolitan areas that seem to have quite a bit of radon knowledge, even if they don't have any radon itself.
Yeah, that is interesting to me. The fact that you're getting these requests from places that don't technically have, much radon to show for, but the concerns of the citizens there, maybe there's a little bit of being a hypochondriac, I think, to some extent,
I think we got a lot of weird questions during COVID where I think people learned a lot more about their houses when they spent more time in their houses. But based on the ones who have called me and asked for follow-up information, they seem to be mostly transplants from the Northeast. So they're people from the Northeast, and people who had a neighbor from the Northeast who gave them this little bit of information. But at the end of the day, Houston is coastal, it's sandy, and it seems very unlikely that you would see a high frequency of hit. Of course, there's always the potential because you never quite know what's below your house. And what's below your house is not necessarily what's below your next door neighbor's house. And so we see quite a bit of variability that way as well.
Right. Awesome. So we do have a question from Facebook. Robert asks, can radon be contained in building materials?
Yes. So let me go ahead and clarify on that. The biggest reason that I receive phone calls for just a radon concentration that seems extremely high is if there's stone in a house. Stone is going to emit natural levels of radiation that actually is not going to affect you, and it's not going to be problematic, except it creates an interface a couple centimeters above the surface that if you happen to stick one of my test kits on that surface, you're going to see radiation. And it's going to come back on that kit, even though that's not reflective of the air that you're building. What that is reflective is the fact that you have a granite countertop. And so if you look at everything that I have, usually first bullet is do not put these test kits on granite countertops. And someone asked me actually the other day, it was a geologist, whether or not you would see this in homes that were actually built out of stone. And that I don't know. I don't know if you've got volcanic formations in some stone-based houses, so I'd have to look a little bit more into that. But I do know the number one reason that I see a false positive on a radon test is because the individual put it out on a granite countertop, and that natural radiation emission that occurs in granite just makes our tests come back with extremely high values that aren't accurate at all. The second reason why we see radon concentrations that are unreliable, and this one's really unfortunate, is they tend to do weird things during high wind events. And it's really interesting to talk to EPA about this because they recommend deploying the tests during 2 to 4 day windows where there is no wind. And of course, the Texas Panhandle, that's just never going to happen.
Right.
And so the general advice that I give people is not during high wind events. And if you think you've got an erratic reading because the wind picked up on day 2 and it was 25 mile an hour, 45 mile an hour gusts, email us and we're going to send you another test kit if it's wind. But those are my two reasons the test will come back wonky is the granite countertops and high wind events. So I'm sorry, I think I cut one of you off.
No, I'm curious with the stone, is it just earthen building materials in general? There are adobe houses and things like that are out here. Is it a kind of a similar scenario with the stone where maybe those actually do create a radon risk factor, but we just don't have the data for that? Or is it,
The answer is, I don't know. It's certainly possible depending upon the formations that are in the stone. It is typically associated with more volcanic mountainous material. So usually when I think of adobe, I think more of a muddy sand mix, but it's certainly possible. I don't know. As I said, I was asked this question earlier this week and it was a good thought, and I haven't had enough time to actually sit down and think it through. I'm sure someone in New Mexico, given the prevalence of stone in that area, I'm sure someone has looked into this. I just had never thought about it because they don't typically associate Texan homes with stone, but it's possible.
So I guess that's a good segue into, could you explain to folks out there what does the testing look like? What is how do they go about testing with your kit?
I've got one right here, and these are my kits, and you'll see it has a number down here, and that just tells me which kit it is. It allows me to talk to the testing company to figure out whether or not my kit was actually used. Side note that I always try to bring up, my program is trying to increase radon awareness and a better radon understanding. What we are not ever going to do is post the radon value of your specific home to our website. We look at data in aggregate, and there's all sorts of ethical violations there if I were to ever look at specific neighborhood level or specific home value. So everything that I report is always at the county level, just to make sure that I increase participation in the program, but yet I'm not actually doing something that would call out somebody's home or decrease property values. But back to your question, test kit looks like this. It's filled with activated carbon, very similar to what a Brita water filter is filled with. And what you do is you will stick it in your house, usually on a surface. You can hang it, but the surface, unless it's a granite countertop, tends to work really, really well. There's a couple restrictions with it. They don't like you to put it by a door because it changes flow. It is supposed to go in the lowest level of your home that you live in. So usually it's a first floor that it goes in, and don't put them in kitchens or bathrooms because those rooms tend to have high fan usage and a lot of air suction, which tends to give you an inaccurate reading of the test. But usually they go in a living room or in some cases a bedroom, just given the amount of time that we spend in bedrooms if it's a first floor bedroom, and it just sits there. And for this particular kit that I have, this is a 2 to 4 day kit. So you just put it out for a minimum of 2 days, a maximum of 4 days. and it sits in your house. And once that time period has come up, there's also a prepaid envelope in here. So you stick it in the envelope, seal the envelope, drop it in the mailbox, and it goes to Carrollton. So it's pretty straightforward, pretty low maintenance. I have a couple of other test kits, which is, I've had a couple of people that have just had the worst luck with wind events. I've also had a couple of individuals that were really, the levels were consistent, but we couldn't tell if it was because they were running a heater. And again, the temperature differential between inside and out, your highest reading is going to be obtained probably in the month of January, because that's when the inside is so much warmer than the outside. So if you run a couple of test kits in January, it's probably going to give you your worst case scenario. So knowing all of that, I do have test kits that can be run for longer periods of time, 90 days up to a year. If you're really interested in knowing, well, is this actually a threat? And that kit works a little bit different. It's not activated carbon. It's actually a ceramic plate, and the chemistry in that's a little bit different, but it's intended for a longer period of time. However, talking to people, most people don't want to wait that long to hear their results, and a test kit that works under a week is more appropriate for the majority of the people that are interested. So the majority of the test kits we give out look just like what I just gave you. I just showed you.
When I think about, you talk about the risk factors primarily like with basements, and when I think about where basements would be located in our city, there would definitely be some in downtown and a lot of those old buildings. And then a lot of the new constructions that are in the south and west parts of our city, many of those will probably have basements. And so are you guys, and I'm sure that you have limited resources like many departments, but are you guys able to do any outreach? Are you able to say target some certain areas that may be high risk and kind of reach out to those folks? Yeah, are you able to do any of that?
So that's what we're trying to do. And that's the reason why I've been talking to as many community groups as possible. Right off the bat, I can tell you that the area that has the least number of tests deployed is anything east of University Avenue. So the majority of the test kits that have come back in Lubbock have been west of University Avenue. And I have only run this, I was lucky enough to inherit this program 2 months before the COVID shut down. And so it's only been recently that we've been able to ramp back up the actual outreach component as opposed to the data analysis component, which is what I had to do for 2 years. So I can't really tell you about outreach efforts prior to that. But I can say that what I'm not seeing is an equal distribution of test kits across Lubbock. I am seeing almost exclusively west of University and a little bit further south, not quite as far south as the new builds, but certainly not equal distribution throughout the city. And so the reason why I was so excited to come on here is I saw it as an opportunity to talk to people from all areas of the city, because anybody in the state of Texas is eligible for one of my test kits, but I'm particularly interested in Lubbock, my home, as well as Amarillo and any of the communities in between, of making sure we get a more equal distribution as to where these kits are going out. And so the best way that I found to do that so far is going through the various neighborhood associations. And actually, as I was prepping for this, I got another email from a neighborhood that is on the east side of Lubbock that I'm hoping to go out there and give presentations on. Again, not particularly targeting any area, but knowing that I have a few gaps in my data and trying to make it a little bit more homogeneous than what I'm looking at right now.
Yeah. So do you have the entire list of all the neighborhood associations? Because if you don't, we can get that to you.
I don't, but if you have them, and I remember meeting you last week at one of the neighborhood associations, I've been kind of going through piecewise by piecewise, but if you got that, that would be great.
Yeah, I do. I attend all of those on a monthly basis.
Exactly.
And so I can get you those. Another good person or group to reach out to is actually on Tech Campus, which is Community Outreach and Engagement with Texas
They
Tech.
have been so helpful. I am working with them. They have gotten me the invitations that I've gotten. And they've just made a series of introductions for me. They have been wonderful to work with. Awesome. I do know that, as I said, I took this over right before COVID. I'd started working with them on this right before we all got sent home. And then I ramped it back up again in January when it became clear that we weren't going to have any limitations. I'm not sure to what extent those connections were leveraged prior to me getting this grant in early 2020. but I'm hoping to improve upon what we currently have to make sure that I am getting out into various neighborhoods and making sure that there is more holistic awareness, if you will.
Awesome. And we do have another question from Robert on Facebook, which is kind of where I was going to go anyway. He says, how do you get rid of radon if it is present in the soil? But that was going to be, I guess, the next question. So if somebody tests and there is a radon issue in their house, then what can they do about it?
So the first thing is take another test. Make sure that actually is a threat, because I wouldn't want you to go down that road unless as a homeowner, you deem you have enough information to determine that that is actually a risk. One problem that I am having with Texas, again, it goes back to the lack of legislation, is the number of radon mitigators. Now, I'm funded by the Environmental Protection Agency, which means that it's illegal for me to recommend any one radon tester, and there are several professional radon testers, as well as a radon mitigator or a radon treater. What I am allowed to do is I am allowed to refer you to, there is a national website of radon testers and radon mitigators. It's called NRPP. And if you Google NRPP radon, it'll come up right away, and it's going to give you anybody who is nationally certified in radon in the state of Texas, either for testing, if you want somebody to come in your home with a specific testing device that can automatically give you radon readings every 10 minutes or so, you can have that option, as well as someone that comes in to actually treat the radon. The problem that I'm having is there aren't that many certified individuals in the state of Texas, particularly when it comes to the treatment side. And so there's this cat and mouse game going on where I hear from residents that they're having difficulty getting someone to come to their home to treat this. And I'm also hearing from home inspectors that are potentially pursuing that certification, and they don't want to pursue it unless they get enough requests. Side note, the NRPP test, not the easiest test. It was a 6-day training for me to take that test in Minnesota in December. It was 10-hour days for 6 days. Wow. I wish I could tell you that I aced that test. I did not. I did pass the test, which was important. But I kind of went in there with the mentality of, I'm going to learn something, but at the end of the day, I'm a university professor. I'll be fine on this test. And that was actually not the case. NRPP makes you work for that information, and they do make sure that if they give you that certification, you know what you're talking about. So currently in this area, I'm aware of one nationally certified radon tester in Lubbock, and I'm aware of one radon mitigator who is located in Amarillo. And so right now, if you come to me asking, where can I find a mitigation expert, I'm going to refer you to that webpage. And while I'm not necessarily directing you to that one individual, I am painfully aware right now that there's only one on the website because everybody else is in the Metroplex or further away. So there is a limitation there in terms of getting a nationally certified mitigator. There are other people who do radon mitigation. I'm just not allowed to recommend them because I'm not sure of their credentials if they haven't gone through that national certification process.
And
go ahead.
What is that, to talk about mitigation? So, I'm playing this out in my head. My parents, like their house fits the bill. They have a basement, no circulation really in there. My mother spends a lot of time in it. She likes the coolness of it. Mm-hmm. What does mitigation look like? Say hypothetically that house, right, tests positive. What does that end up meaning, and what ends up happening to the homeowners?
So in a nutshell, suction. What you actually have to do is run a suction line below the level of the house that you're concerned about. So for the most part in Lubbock, it's going to be running suction in a crawl space, because the majority of homes in Lubbock do have that crawl space, so that you're sucking out any air that is emitting from the ground before it creeps up into that first floor. You can do that either for a slab or for a crawl space. It actually works easier with a slab, because if you've got a slab foundation, just one giant square of concrete, the gas does tend to pool very nicely underneath it. So it's a little easier to suck versus a crawl space where you've actually got to generate that suction because there's lots of air. But it is running PVC and suction. It looks like a little PVC pipe that usually they're pretty good about masking, and you can't see it from either the inside or the outside of the house. And then it's operated by a little fan, and the fan actually provides the force to withdraw the air from that area below the house up through the PVC pipe and out the top of your home. When I was a graduate student at Illinois, I actually lived in a basement, and right above my bed was the radon fan. And for a graduate student in Illinois, which has radon levels that are ridiculous, and all those homes have basements, that was actually a selling feature from my rental agreement.
I could imagine, yeah.
If you lived in, and you can't hear the fans at all, but if you live in a house that has a radon fan, it means you're not breathing in radon, even though you've got a basement apartment. So it is done, and it is done in a number of places. I'm not aware of too many people in this area that have actually gone through mitigation. And again, I'm kind of seeing that on the flip side, because I'm seeing resistance from home inspectors that do other tasks that are similar to this to getting that certification, because they don't necessarily see the business. So there's a bit of a, as I said, cat and mouse game. I don't quite know how to solve that one.
And there's one, Robert asked another question that I think is really a really good one to think about. In Lubbock, we're about 50-50 rental population in single family homes versus homeowners in single family homes. Mm-hmm. If you are renting a house and you discover this, I mean, is this something that you can take it from a legal standpoint and say this is an exposure, or does the federal government say, oh, the levels are so high, the landlord is compelled to provide mitigation, or are you just up a creek? Is there nothing that you can do?
So because I'm awareness, I tend to avoid the legality. Honestly, I don't have a legal background, and I would feel uncomfortable commenting on legality. I am aware of at least one situation that is going on in another part of the state that is exactly what you described. It is a renter suing a landlord because it was multiple elevated radon tests. My understanding is that the landlord did call in a professional company to test, and the levels were very, very high. The resident got a hold of the radon levels, and then the radon wasn't addressed. And there actually is a legal suit going on in a completely different part of the state. I don't quite know what the status is of that. I do know that the reason I'm aware of this is because the resident called me with a series of questions and actually tried to get me involved. And I said, I can't get involved, although I can direct you to more radon sources, but it really does sound like you need legal aid and not necessarily a free test kit from my program that introduces you to the concept of radon, because it sounds like you covered the bases. Yeah. That is more of an issue in other states. That is actually a huge issue in other states. And there are a couple of federal agencies that are looking into that legality of what happens if someone else owns the building. But I'm not sure how prevalent that is in Texas, besides the one example that I'm aware of in the southeastern part of the state.
Right.
Yeah. Well, this is a good time, I guess, to let folks know, how do they get a hold of you to get a test? I know you'll be going around to some of the neighborhood association meetings, but how can folks reach out to you on their own and get one of these?
Absolutely. So if you Google Texas Radon, the first website that comes up is Health and Human Services from the state. And if you click on that link, it says, we don't handle radon. Please go to this website. And that is my website. And looking at my website traffic, the majority of people go through the state website, click on that link, and then come to me. I did just Google myself in anticipation of this question. So number one is Health and Human Services. Number two is a map. It's the old 1993 EPA map of the state of Texas that shows average concentrations. The third thing that comes down on the Google list is now my website. So you can either go to the third link, which has TTU in it, or you can go to that very first link, which will immediately redirect you to me. But yeah, just Google Texas Radon. And that's something that I worked very hard at to make sure that it was something that was easy to find and I wasn't on page 3 of a Google search.
Yeah. Yeah. And so is it, would they just send you an email, or is it a phone call, or
is there like a forum on there?
So there's a form that you fill out on my website, and it asks a couple of basic questions. One of the questions has to do with eligibility, and it'll ask, I need financial aid for this kit. I live in a diverse area. I right now do not filter that. That is, EPA does give me the ability to start filtering requests if I receive a surge of too many of them. I am not doing that at this point. I don't see a future where I'm going to start doing that, although the form is set up that way. So anybody who sends me a request via that form, what happens is that form is emailed directly to one of my hourly workers. That hourly worker makes a list every single week. She tends to show me who's on it. As I said, that's how I know that all the requests are coming in from Austin and Houston. But usually on Thursdays, she'll go in and she'll just mail out all the test kits. And all you need to do is fill out your name and email address, and she'll email you when she's emailing out your kit. And of course, the address as to where the kit is going. If it is something uncommon, such as it's a second kit and you're looking to verify, if you're looking for one of those long-term kits, that's usually either an email or a phone call. The emails do go to my hourly workers. If they don't know the answer, it gets immediately forwarded to me. The phone calls are redirected to me. So that way we have the option of answering questions. My hourly workers have, I would say, canned answers for the top 8 to 10 questions that come up, and they're very comfortable with modifying it for the very specific examples that are given. But as I said, if it's anything, and my main worker in particular, if she doesn't know, she's immediately going to hit forward and the response is going to come from me.
Awesome. Well, this has been very interesting.
Yeah, I'm really grateful you came on.
Yeah, it's good to know about this, because obviously, like you said, this is not a big problem in Texas. And when I was talking about doing the show, somebody told me, well, that's kind of a random topic, and I was like, yeah, it is, but that's why we need to let folks know so that it's not so random. As Dr. Millerick pointed out, we have elevated levels of this in
this
our
is
area.
The region that matters.
So I think that this would be something good for folks to do out there, especially if you have a basement or if you know somebody that has a basement. And I do know that in central Lubbock, particularly in Tech Terrace and areas like this, some of those do also have basements. Mm-hmm. And so even if you don't have a basement, it doesn't hurt to check. But I would encourage everybody to Google Texas Radon and get to Dr. Millerick's site there at Texas Tech and get you a kit. It can't hurt. It never hurts to test what's going on in your house. And even if you are renting, I would still encourage folks to do it, because you may never know. If there is an issue, you may have a landlord that would work with you. It just really depends on the landlord.
Yeah, or you might move.
Yeah, or you might need to move. So either way, I think it's good to know, especially anything that may affect you or your family. And so I want to thank you, Dr. Millerick, for coming on and bringing awareness to this issue, and for the work you're doing, and for just letting everybody know about this. Thank you.
No, thank you very much for the opportunity. As I said, I'm trying so hard to put myself in front of different audiences. And when I was contacted over this, I was overjoyed. So thank you very much.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. Well, this is, we've spoke about neighborhood associations several times on this. And so this is your weekly reminder to join your neighborhood association meeting, because as I say all the time, you can miss out on resources, and Dr. Millerick is clearly one of those resources. When you go to your neighborhood association meetings, number one, they're all about, well, they've been all very active in the past 2 years, but they're just only going to get more active. We have a neighborhood planner that is also visiting all of those, and we've got so many folks from different city departments visiting those, and they're all very active. So if you would like to know where your neighborhood association is, you can reach out to us at Lubbock Compact, and we know where they all are. If you don't have a neighborhood association, you can always start one. So there's that. But yeah, that's my spiel. I always tell everybody every week to join their neighborhood association meeting. And so this is just another reminder. So thank you once again, Dr. Millerick. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And we will be right back here next week.